Hey, podcast listeners, Ria Wong with you once again. So this must be Nonprofit Lowdown. Today, my guest is LaTresse Snead. She is the author of When Black Women Rise, which is a new book. It just hit Amazon like a storm. She's also the CEO of Bonsai Leadership Group. And today we are talking about both surviving and thriving as a Black leader. LaTresse, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Ria. It's great to be here, and I've had so much fun getting to know you in this process. So
I
I'm excited
know.
for our conversation today.
Same here. Nonprofit executives turned authors. I feel like we have a little mini club going on here. Um,
We do.
oh, by the way, I was like LinkedIn stalking you and I realized that you went to San Francisco State.
Yes, I did. What do you know about San Francisco State?
I am a third generation native San Franciscan, which
Are you?
there are
Oh,
not very many of us.
there aren't very many of us. I
Are
was
you
born at, yeah, I was born in San Francisco.
Kaiser?
No, San Francisco General, I believe. Yeah.
Where'd you go to high school? Sorry, this is a side note
So I went
conversation.
to high school in Sacramento. So yeah,
Interesting.
yep. So we lived in Bayview Hunters Point
Uh-huh,
until I
uh-huh.
was about 5 or 6. And then we moved to Sacramento,
Got it.
California. I went to elementary, middle, and high school there, and then moved back to San Francisco.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Well, we have to have a whole other like Bay Area conversation too. By the way, I was recently back in California. Like Sacramento is really cool now. I don't know if you knew that, but it's like
It
post.
is.
Yeah, it's really cool. Like it used to have this like cowtown reputation, but now it's like all the cool kids are in
Mhm.
Sacto.
It's kind of scary how cool it was, but my brother and I went there for the first time in many years right before COVID, and we had a blast. We had a blast. We could
Yeah,
not believe it.
it's so fun, right? And like the restaurant scene. Anyway, well, this is a sidebar conversation, but we're going to talk about all the things. I was like, that's why I love her. Bay Area, I love. Okay. All right, let's jump into it, friend. So, before you were an author, before you owned your own business, which also, by the way, like side note, was has been very successful a year out, which is like incredible. You were in the
Yeah.
nonprofit field. So, talk to us a little bit about the journey that has brought you here today.
Oh goodness. I have been in the nonprofit space for over 20 years. So I've worked for some of the biggest nonprofit organizations, including Boys and Girls Clubs of America, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, American Red Cross, the Nature Conservancy. I even did a stint on the for-profit side, leading a corporate philanthropy program, supporting nonprofits and creating some of those brand nonprofit kind of partnerships. So I have a lot of experience, and oftentimes in these organizations, I was one of a few Black women in leadership, which has its challenges. But yes, as you mentioned today, I am the founder and CEO of Bonsai Leadership Group. And just based on my experiences in the nonprofit space, I wanted to help other organizations create spaces for people to thrive, especially those that are for people of color.
Okay, Latrice, I'm just gonna go like jump right into the deep end here. So, folks who listened to my last episode with Darren Isom, who is a dear, dear friend and so funny and so wise, talked about this phenomenon that we've been seeing, especially post George Floyd, of organizations hiring folks of color, specifically in many cases Black women, to lead, and it is a hot ass mess in there. So can you talk a little bit about, is this
Uh-huh.
something that you've noticed? And if so, like, I don't know, how do you help leaders who are so qualified and so committed and so passionate, but have just inherited a mess?
Oh yes, I have been through it myself. So right during kind of the social justice reckoning, I remember just getting call after call after call from nonprofit organizations that were saying, hey, we want to hire an executive leader on our team. We want to talk to you. I was talking probably to about 7 or 8 different organizations at the time that kept on saying they wanted leadership and they wanted to be a different organization. And I kept asking the question, well, why me? And what do you see in me? Going back to the skills. There was one organization in particular that said all of the right things. And I said, I'm a different kind of leader. I mean, you're going to get what you get with me. I don't hold my tongue. I tell it like it is. Oh, that's what we want. That's what we want. No, that is not what they wanted. They were not ready for it. But there are a lot of organizations, and I've kind of shared this before, that want the Black voice, Black body, but they don't want the Black voice, right? So they want that person of color to show up so they can say they're supporting, people of color and racial diversity. But at the end of the day, they either want you to clean up some kind of big mess with no budget and no decision-making authority, right?
Girl,
It's a
okay.
losing battle,
So let's back it up here. So for folks that are listening to this, particularly, young Black folks who want to aspire into these executive roles, what are the red flags, if you will, of organizations that say the right things, but may not be doing the right thing? So like, how might I be able to tell if I'm actively in a job search?
So one of the things that we actually tell our potential candidates at Bonsai for different jobs are to ask a few questions of that organization. One are, what are some of the challenges that you're facing right now when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Hopefully, they are very honest with you to say that there are some challenges. Here are the challenges that we're facing. What are you doing to solve those challenges? So asking, what are you doing to take care? We're not asking for you to be perfect. We don't think that you should be perfect. Let me correct that. We do eventually want you to be perfect, but we know that it takes some time. I want to see that you're taking action and that you are being serious. What have you done? What have people in your organization come to you about that you have taken action on? So demonstrate the same way you ask me about my experience and what I've done to achieve my goals. What have you done to achieve some of your goals? Give me some examples of how you've supported leaders of color in your organization. So just as you would be interviewed by the organization, I encourage people to interview the organization as well.
So do you recommend doing anything that's sort of external? So one thing I've heard folks say is like, look at the board, look at the staff. Like it'll tell you everything you need to know about how much they value diversity. Like, do you do that? Do you look at, I don't know, like I assume you might Google search. I assume you might look at the 990s. Like what sort of other due diligence might you recommend for folks?
I think you could go even one step further and actually reach out to some of those people at those organizations. So yes, looking to see who's in leadership, who is on the board, reaching out to people you may know at that organization. I have actually been contacted still to this day from people who are applying at organizations that I've worked at to say, know you used to work there. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you experienced? How is it? What's the culture like? And most times people will be very open with you. You can also ask them, who else should I talk to? So this is the same thing that recruiters do, when they're doing professional reference checks. They talk to people in your circle, but they also ask, who else should I speak to so that I can have a better understanding of what the type of environment I'm going into.
Okay, so let's say you do your due diligence. It seems like, you've kicked the tires. It's a challenge that you are willing to take on. I want to talk about one area that I know is particularly sensitive for, I think, women and women of color is negotiating the salary. What tips can you offer? Because, I think historically we know that women get paid, what is it, 80 cents on the dollar, and then like 30 cents on the dollar for Black women. So in this moment of time, I'm hoping that it's a window that stays open, but it feels like it might be kind of closing, where Black women are really in the driver's seat in some ways as far as negotiation between the pandemic and the Great Resignation and the desire to have Black leadership. How do you recommend that folks negotiate their salaries or their compensation,
Yeah.
I should say?
The great thing is that a lot more organizations now are being very public about their salary ranges. So that helps. So if you apply to a job or you're called by a recruiter that is publicly sharing the salary range, to me, that's a good sign that they care about salary transparency, equity. If they don't share it, some people say, well, should I even still apply if they're not sharing a salary range? That's up to you. But one of the things that you can do, especially when it's an executive level position, I always use the 990. Go to the 990, see what the top employees are being paid. So if you're applying also for a chief position, what are the other chiefs being paid? But also take into consideration your value, your background, your experience. It's okay to put that number that you want on the table. The worst that they can say is no, that doesn't fit our range. Sometimes there are other things that you might care about that you want to negotiate. So let's say they can't meet your current salary. Maybe it's just short by a little bit. Maybe they'll be willing to add additional vacation time. Maybe they will include a professional coach or executive coach for you, additional professional development opportunities. So there are other things that you can negotiate besides just salary. Nowadays, a lot of people negotiate working from home or working from the location that they live in and not moving to the location of the headquarters of the organization. So it's not just the salary, but there are other things that you can negotiate too.
Well, and I think you said something that's really important. I want people to really hear is understand your value, right? Because I think so often the value of women's work and the value of women of
Mm-hmm.
color's labor is undervalued. And that's why we under
Mm-hmm.
negotiate. That's why we're not paid what we're worth. And so I think so important to understand like what is your value to the organization? What is the value you're going to create? And therefore, what is the commensurate value that they should pay you in exchange for your contribution? Um, it's
And
funny.
if you if it doesn't meet your expectations, it's okay to say no. It's
Hmm.
so okay to,
Yeah,
you know.
it's like my mom used to say when I was dating, there are lots of fish in the sea. Don't worry about it.
Uh-huh. Well, and then there's one other tip that I would say, you know, negotiate at the end when you know that you're the top candidate, you are the one that they want. At that point in time, they'll do anything to keep you because it's hard to find top talent. It's also hard for organizations to find that right person that will fill their needs. So when you get to that end of that process, put the number that you want out there. If they want you bad enough, they're likely to try and meet you.
Well, and I think the other point that you said, which was so important too, is negotiate for an executive coach because so often
Mm.
people are hired into these jobs, they've never been an ED before or a CEO before. So, how are you supposed to know how to do it? And so, I think when we think about setting people up for success, regardless of your racial background, I think you have to negotiate for a coach to support you along that way.
Mhm. You do, especially in these executive roles or even in times of transition. Let's say you're going from a manager to a director position. We don't often, I know I didn't, when I was going from a manager to a director, I didn't think that there was going to be any difference other than maybe I was going to have a few more responsibilities over the program strategy. But there is a difference. And
LOL.
having
Surprise.
and surprise. But there is a big difference in a coach, an executive coach can help you, really step up into that role and transition from a manager to someone that is actually directing programs and teams and looking at the organization as a whole versus just your specific program or purpose.
So you said something earlier that when you were in these roles in nonprofits, you were often the only Black leader.
Mhm.
What, I mean, so many questions here. So let me just start with one question. Like, what do you think the biggest lessons learned were for you?
So the biggest lessons learned were a lot. Um, One that I don't think that I think a lot of people don't think about is that it's a lot of pressure not only to be the only Black leader a lot of times or the highest ranking Black leader in an organization, not only being in a in a community where there's no one that looks like you, but then you are that one person for so many other people in the organization, right? And so I remember being at one organization where a lot of other people of color constantly came to me sharing their disappointments, their hurts, their struggles, within the organization, but there was no one else for them to turn to in leadership to get that advice, to understand how they should take the next course of action. So there was a lot of pressure on both sides of being, one of a few or the only Black leader. I also encountered that constant, what would Black people think? And
You're
I
like,
remember,
on behalf of all Black people everywhere, I would like to say, like, yeah,
I know I
ridiculous.
had a conversation with this woman. I was like, you're gonna have to ask all Black people. And she was just kind of stunned. And so always trying to speak up and hold that balance of speaking up for community, but also getting people to understand that everybody is individual and their thinking and how they show up and what they want. So it's a real hard balance.
One question for you, because I know this is something I've heard a lot of my Black women friends say, is trying to hold that tension between being assertive, having a voice, saying what you really mean, and getting lumped into the bucket of being the angry Black woman.
Oh yeah, I got over that as I got older.
What
so
do you mean?
so I started out very fearful in my leadership of speaking out, because I didn't want those labels. I didn't want to be seen as angry. I didn't want to be seen as inflexible. All of those negative things that women, and especially women of color, tend to think about when it comes to speaking up and using your voice in the workplace, or disagreeing, or having a different idea of how something should go. And at some point, I don't know what it was, I just said, you know what, that's got to go out. It takes so much energy to filter myself, my thoughts, that I had to kind of throw it out the window. And I noticed that once I started to just authentically speak up for myself, for my team, for my program, but in a way where people could hear and understand me, it was so much more impactful. I felt good. And if they didn't like it, that was their issue, that was their problem. But at the end of the day, no one can say that I didn't stand up for my team. I didn't stand up for my program. I didn't say what needed to be said when it needs to be said. Now, at the end of the day, you might agree with me and we might not move forward with my idea. We might, but I always would tell people, I'm not for everybody. I'm just letting you know, I'm not for everybody. But what I learned in using my voice more is that people start to respect that more. And I had one supervisor in particular, and he said, you always say the hard things that I need to hear. And he said, and I haven't always wanted to hear those things, but you say it in a way that really resonates with me and makes me look at your perspective in a way that is more open. And I feel like you really care about, the organization or whatever we were discussing. So I think sometimes it's just the care in which we say things. But sometimes it's also just not having that fear around you either.
So, LaTresse, I'm curious about, as a leader of color or as a Black leader, I think that there is this assumption, rightly or wrongly, that you're going to come in with an agenda to, you know, change the organization so it's more DEI focused or more equity focused. And I'm just wondering, like, is it a fair assumption that we can make for folks of color? And if not, or if so, like, what does that process look like?
It's not a fair assumption. In fact, there are some people who they specifically want to go into organizations and they care about DEI and they want to really focus on that. But for many, people want to just do the job that they were hired for. And so, I have been tapped in many cases. Hey, can you be on our DEI committee? Can you sponsor our DEI committee? Can you look at our DEI charter? We really need a DEI program. Can you do it? And I'm like, you need to hire somebody for that. I don't have the background. Just because I'm a Black face does not mean I have the background, skills, or qualifications to create your DEI strategy, right? And so I think that's shocking when people hear it. They're kind of like, oh. And so that has been kind of my response to those questions. I was asked one time, well, why aren't you part of the ERGs? And I was like, yeah, the employee resource groups. I'm sorry for saying ERGs, but employee resource group. And it's like, I know what will happen. You will use that as a way to say, this is our DEI strategy, and that's not a DEI strategy. So hire someone that actually has the background and experience to lead those opportunities, and then ask everyone to participate in supporting that strategy. Ask everyone's opinion on that strategy. Don't just look to the Black leader to make all the decisions on that, or the person of color.
Yeah, I love that, and I think that needs to be. I think it's changing, but certainly, uh, a couple of years ago, it was very much the default. Like, well, you're a person of color, you know about diversity. It's like, uh, speaking on behalf of all the Asian people, but also capacity. Like, hire
Yeah.
people for whom this is their expertise. Like, why are we expecting people
Right.
to know about stuff just because of their lived experience? Like, it's kind of a ridiculous thing.
It is. And it still even happens today in my business. Nowhere on my website does it say I do diversity strategy or anything like that. I care deeply about racially diverse systems and organizations, but I don't do DEI strategy. At least once a week, Ria, I have people saying, hey, can you come in and help us with our DEI strategy? And it's because I care. I might post about those things, but that doesn't mean that I have the background for it.
Yeah, it's hear that. So hopefully this podcast will help. Do not call LaTresse for DEI strategy, y'all. She is not available for that. So let's talk about
I can refer you to a lot of other people that could do that very well.
That's right. She has trusted colleagues, but do not call her for that. So let's talk about, you got you did your due diligence, you got the job, you're in the job, you're doing the thing. How do we decide? How do we transition out when we decide there's a new season for us in a way that is graceful and preserves your reputation as a professional? Because I've seen some messy separations, as you could imagine.
Yeah, and I've been there. I've had all kinds. I think the best way is to, of course, give your notice. And this is, once you decide that you no longer want to be somewhere, this is not the time to say, well, this is why, and this is what went wrong. You had your chance to say those things, and hopefully those things people listen. And if they didn't, at that time, you're moving on to something else, or to a place where that values your voice, where you'll be able to use your talent. But leaving out the door is not the time to kind of air all of your grievances, right? It's the time to just focus on the future. So giving appropriate notice. I'm a big fan, if you're in an executive or leadership level, of giving a month's notice, just because there's a lot of transition that you have to do, not only with your team has to get used to the idea of this person is not going to be there. So what does that mean for me? But then all of your projects. So that's the most graceful way to leave. But I will also say, Ria, if it's a situation that's causing, a impact on your mental health, I'm good with just throwing up two deuces and saying, you know what? I'm not going to allow myself to be in this space anymore, or to be treated this way anymore. And effective immediately, I'm leaving the organization.
So let's dig into that. Like, how do you know when it's time to go, right? Because I do think Like, you know, when you're being harmed, you know, when it's detrimental to your mental health and so forth. And I would also say, like, sometimes just being in the ED role is detrimental to your mental health. So,
Mhm,
like, whether it's racial or not, it's like it's a heavy load to carry. So, in your
mhm.
experience, what are the indicators that it's time to move on?
So that's a hard question because I think it's different for everyone, right? So for me, um, in my last nonprofit career, I knew it wasn't for me anymore when I realized that my values and the values of the leadership were not in alignment. And now, knowing that if I'm in executive leadership, I represent the decisions that are being made about the organization. I have to explain this to my team. And, just certain conversations, I was going, I can't be aligned with this. I don't agree with this conversation. I don't agree with that statement. And I wanted to be associated with an organization or a movement that really aligned with my leadership behaviors, expectations, values, organizational kind of environment. And so for me, it was an immediate, like, I can't take this
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
anymore.
So it sounds like, though, that there's a level of self-reflection and maturity to be able to really even know what your values are or what you're looking for. So can you talk about how did you get to that point? Did you have a coach? Did you do some personal work? Like, how do you get to the place of understanding A, what your values are, and B, whether or not these values are aligned with your
Yeah.
organization?
So there was two things. So even before kind of that self-reflection, years ago, I was in a position where I felt like I was in that toxic type of culture. And I felt like I couldn't quit because I had, a family. We had, you thinking about the bills, and it's like, okay, how long is it going to take to get another job? And we all know how hard it is to look for a job while you have another job. And, when you're just emotionally exhausted, it's just so stressful. And someone told me, they were like, this is why you have your FU money lined up, so that at any time you think this is no longer for me, you can leave and you will have a buffer to carry you until you find that next thing. So once I heard that, I certainly put that into place. So I always had that, and that let go of a lot of fear for me in any of these situations. It's like I didn't have to fear speaking up. I didn't have to fear if, okay, they're not going to like what I say and they're going to let me go, because I know I have my little nest egg to fall back on, and anything that I feel doesn't align with my values or doesn't feel good, I can make a decision for me. And I don't have to wait for others to change or do something different. So that was the first part. Yeah. It's just making sure that I was going to be financially secure and I could confidently make any decision that I need to make. And then the next part of that self-reflection was, what kind of leader do I want to be? And I'm the type of person that I am a leader for my team. I am like that team mama bear champion. You know, I'm going to influence as much as possible throughout the organization, not only to make the right decisions, but to get the resources needed for my team, to help them thrive and be successful. And when I feel like I can't do that, I can't continue to go to my team and say, well, you can't do that. Well, we can't do that. We can't do that. It's like the constant disappointment. Um, and so if I'm not effective as a leader in that particular environment because of the way it's structured, like, yeah, I just felt like it's time, because this person, this organization wants to lead in the way that they want to lead, and it's out of alignment in what I think needs to happen in order for us all to be successful.
talk about a little bit of invisible labor, and then I want to start talking about your book. But one thing that I noticed for myself in being an executive director is it felt like there were a lot of unsaid expectations that my staff had of me to essentially like be the mama bear, to be the therapist, to be the confidant. And I was really kind of taken aback by it because I was like, my job is I am your boss. Like I am here to help
Mhm.
you do your job, to get you the resources. But like, I don't know. It felt like there was this expectation because I was a woman, perhaps, I don't know, um, of
Mhm.
being this like maternal figure. And I don't, I
Mhm.
guess I'm just wondering, like, is that something that you've witnessed with women leaders? Because like no one is
Yes.
expecting like their male CEO to be like their dad figure. You know what I mean?
I remember when one of the very first teams I led, and I was so confused at what was happening because it seemed like each week I had people in my office crying. And it wasn't anything about the job. It was just like, my boyfriend left me, or I didn't have money for gas this morning. And I'm just like, what is happening right now? And so I've learned over time, refer people to resources that can help them. There's the employee assistance program, or maybe you need to talk to someone outside of the organization. Who do you have in your network that you may talk? So referring them back, especially when it's a personal situation, to something that's personal that can help them. When I was referring to Mama Bear, I'm talking about protecting my team in terms of achieving our goals, getting the resources that we need, anything that they need to be successful, I'm going to fight for. Um, but yeah, I always say, great. Do you need to take some time off? Do you need some FMLA? I'm very supportive in that way. But and we all want to be empathetic too, but to a certain point, right? And it's hard as a leader because people do see you once you start to be that empathetic person, they want to come to you for everything a lot of times. Everything.
Yeah, yeah. Oh yes. I'm like, why am I in a conversation with you about your boyfriend? Like I really don't need you. This is not why I'm being paid. Um, let's talk about your book. And you know what? Shout out to our friend Isabella Masucci. She helped me with my book and was my former student. I know she helped you out with your book, but talk to me a little bit about who's it for?
Yeah, so I love Isabella. I would not have this book if it wasn't. So we talked a little bit about coaching. There are coaches for everything. There are life coaches, there are executive coaches, there are business coaches, and Isabella Mascucci is like the best book coach you can have. She will help you with your story telling. She will help you define what the purpose of the book and who the book is for. Like, I would not have this book if it wasn't for her guidance and coaching.
Samesies, Isabella Masucci. So I've known Isabella since she was 12 years old in my program, and I could not little like advertising for that. But she has just turned into such an incredible human, and I'm so proud of her. And she's now built this business to help folks like you and me get our big ideas out into the world. So shout out to Bella and anyone who's listening who wants to write a book, call Bella. I'll put her info in the show notes. You need this woman's help. So
You really do need this woman. So when I came to her, so one of the reasons why I even decided to read a book, I was actually working with a business coach. And the business coach said, you're only one person. You can only coach so many people before you can't coach anybody else, right? And so, how do you make, number one, your services accessible to people, for people that maybe they can't afford a coach, maybe they just don't have access to you, whatever the reason, how do you make what you're doing accessible to people? And he said a book could be one of those ways. And I was like, a book, okay. So I was introduced to Bella, and so Bella said, well, why do you want to write this book? And I was like, I want to write a book about leadership. I want to infuse coaching. And I said, but at the same time, I'm no leadership expert. Everybody, I am not a leadership expert. But I have learned some things along the way from my experiences, my failures. And I said, I just kind of want to share that with people because people might be struggling with some of the same things. A lot of times during coaching, people ask me, well, how did you deal with this? Or what would you have done? And that's not coaching. That is absolutely not coaching. And so this was a way to just share my experiences and some of the themes that I talk about, imposter syndrome, microaggressions, taking 2 steps back to go 4 steps forward. All of these things are things that I know other people are experiencing. And so I just wanted to kind of put that out there to just share my leadership journey, but we also include some self-coaching and reflection exercises in the book so that people can also define what that journey or explore what they might need next in their leadership journey.
It's so funny as you're talking. It's like thinking about the book that I wrote as well. And essentially, we're just sort of writing for our younger selves, are we not? Like, I wrote the book for the little baby Edie who had no idea how to fundraise, what to do. Like, I was clueless. And yet, through the experience of having gone through it, and like, can I just save all of the little baby Rias? Years and years and years of trial and error and like pain and suffering. Like, here,
Yeah.
just read the book.
Well, and it's interesting because when you say, well, who is the book for? So initially, I was thinking Black women in the nonprofit space, right? But as you know, Ria, as the book goes, people pick it up and they read it. And I got a text message from a friend. She's a white woman, and she was at the store with her daughter. And she sent me this poem that her daughter had written about fear. And she said, oh gosh, I'm going to get teary-eyed because she said she was in her car and she's like, my daughter went into the store by herself for the first time. And she's like, because she said F fear. And it was after she had read about the fourth chapter in your book. And she was like, I can do this on my own. I'm going to do it. And so for her as a mother, she was just like, oh my gosh, I'm seeing my daughter grow and overcome her fears. This is something that I've always told her to do. Like, you can go into the store by yourself, you can do it. And then, and she wouldn't do it because she was so scared of what other people would think, or she was awkward or whatever it may be. And then so her as a mother, she was just like, thank you. She was like, I didn't know how your book was going to touch her. And this is much bigger than I could have ever imagined. So,
Oh,
when you
gosh.
say who is a book for, it's really for everybody.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so funny with books. It's like you just don't know where it's going to end up, right? You don't know the impact that it's going to make. But on
Yeah.
that point, with your books, when Black women rise, what are you hoping that people will get out of it? Like once you read the book, what's the transition? What's the transformation they'll experience?
I hope that people really understand the power of a couple of things. Number one, overcoming your fear and just doing you. Like, if you got to be you because it's too hard to be somebody else. And people are going to talk about you anyway. So just go ahead and just be you, right? I think I took too long to get to that point in my life. So I'm hoping that people realize that a lot sooner. Number two, I want people to understand the power of coaching and having a network around you to give you other perspectives for you to share some of your disappointments, your failures, to brainstorm with you. Is incredibly helpful to have a small group of trusted, whether it's colleagues, a coach, or friend that you can depend on to say, no, you're not wrong, no, you're not in your head, you are awesome, you can do that. That will encourage you to really be who you truly are and to have that confidence. So those are a couple of reasons why I hope people read my book, and I hope it impacts them.
It's funny as you're talking to, because I think this is really the power of coaching, which is we get out of our own sort of loops that we create in our heads and these narratives. So I was recently working on a presentation I'm going to give next week, and I was reading this psychotherapist book, and she says the three main lies that we tell ourselves is I'm not good enough, I'm different, therefore I don't belong. And what I want is not available to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you play these things on loop in your mind, it sort of manifests itself in not really getting what you want, right? Because you're just in this
Right.
place. And I think women of color are more susceptible to these sorts of lies. Would you
Mm-hmm.
agree with that?
Absolutely. All three of them. And I think that from my very first coaching experience, that was one of the things that my coach helped me with, is getting out of those loops. And she was very good at listening to stories of success, or times when I felt the most confident, or when I was really successful in whatever it was I was trying to do. In those moments when I was kind of like, I don't know how to do this, or they're not going to choose me. And she was like, wait a second, let's go back to the time you told me about this. You did it then. And she was just really helpful in maintaining my confidence and making sure that I remembered, I actually do know how to do this stuff. I've done it before. What do I need to do again? And what's the worst that can happen? So always kind of having that network around you that can kind of bring you back to reality when that negative self-talk starts to hit you.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's so easy to get into catastrophizing,
Mhm.
especially I think I'll speak for myself as like a Chinese American in my
Mhm.
family, the lingua franca is like catastrophizing, like all the things that could go wrong, all of
Yeah.
the ways that like this could be dangerous, right? So of course, like in
Mhm.
my loop, I'm like, oh yeah, that like feels like a very familiar story to tell myself.
Yeah. And see, so in my book, I actually talk about what can go right. So I think we all do that. We all say, okay, let's talk about the risk. So, like, what could go wrong in this idea? Well, I'm not going to leave my job because I won't get a check every 2 weeks. I won't have health insurance. You just start thinking of all the things that could go wrong. Um, but what could go right? What if, when I started my business, if I just focused on all the things that could have gone wrong, I wouldn't be here talking to you right now. I wouldn't, because I would have talked myself out of it, and I would have taken, applied for the first next job. But instead I thought, here are all the things that could potentially go right if I put my time and effort into it, and any challenges that I might face, will face someone and get to it. But I'm going to focus on what could go right.
Yeah, I love that. I have the same thing when I started my business, right? I went through all of the worst case scenarios. I'm going to end up at the side of a river in a cardboard box with a bunch of cats eating my face. Like like it went to crazy town. But then I was like, but what could go right? And now, being business owners, I'm like, I'm a free bird. I am never going back. So
Never,
yeah,
girl.
I know.
You and I
Listen,
both.
listen, you and I are gonna have another conversation about being women who own their own businesses and make money. That's what I want to talk about next.
Yes.
Okay, LaTresse,
Yes. And have a life of self-care and creating,
hello.
environment to thrive, right?
Come on now. That's a whole other conversation, which I want to get into. Because the other thing is, I think as women of color, we we're taught that we shouldn't talk about money, right? Like we're so conditioned to say, you're like, oh well, I'll take the crumbs and that'll be good enough. I'm out here trying to be like,
Yeah.
no, I want to make a lot of money. And I'm absolutely
Yeah.
unapologetic about it.
I'm the same way. And I'll never forget, because you know, it, growing up, I made more money than my parents did, even with my very first job. And it was like, oh my gosh, that's great money. You're doing so well. You're so successful. I mean, it was like $50,000 or
Yeah.
something like that. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
okay, great. Once I started making over six figures, it was like, you should never leave that job. That's a good job. Don't leave that
Right.
job. That's
Right.
a good job.
Right.
So then you get into that space of fear, like, oh yeah, it is a good job. I probably shouldn't, because this is good money or whatever. So there comes that fear again around money, but it's like, wait a second, I can still make this or more and still be happy and have what I need. And, so it's that whole money thing. It just, I feel in the Black community too.
Oh, 110%, right? It's almost like
Mhm.
crabs in a barrel. Like we can't imagine a world where you could just make all of the money that you possibly want. So we're like, oh, but to be safe, you have to just be content with just enough, right? Like if it's a six-figure job, you better hold on to it. Like
Yeah.
I remember when I started my consulting business, my mom, I was home and she like slid a check across the table to me. And I was like, what is this? She's like, well, I'm just worried. I'm just worried you're not going to be able to pay your rent. I was like, Mom, I'm fine. Like it's cute. Thank you, but I'm doing good.
I'm okay.
Yeah, I'm okay. But
Yeah.
anyway, we're gonna have another conversation about women of color making money. Can we do that?
Okay. That
We're gonna
sounds good.
we're gonna put that on the calendar because that's a whole other thing. LaTresse, thank you so much for everything that you do. Thank you for this beautiful book. Folks out there, whether you're a Black woman or not, go out, buy it, review it on Amazon. When Black Women Rise. LaTresse, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you, Ria. It was wonderful to be here. I love being in conversation with you.
Same here. So, folks, if you liked this conversation, feel free to give me a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and check out my newsletter at riawong.com.